everybody, I'm Lena and welcome back to my channel, or welcome to my channel if you're new. I'm a 22-year-old living in New York and I do videos about software engineering, computer science, New York City, lifestyle, anything like that. So you should definitely check me out, like, comment, subscribe. But in today's video, I'm doing a highly requested video. I know, highly requested for my channel, which is like a couple people asked, but okay. A highly requested video about how to prepare for a software engineering interview. So I've broken down this video into three components. The first is the behavioral interview, the second is the actual technical interview, and the third is the afterward component. So if you're interested in one of those in particular, you can check the timestamps in the description and you can just skip to the part that you're most interested in. But I've written out some of the things that I think are most important for each section, so I'm gonna go over those right now. So the first part of the interview is always going to be a behavioral question, or this might be at the end, but generally I feel like people ask it first because it's kind of a warm-up question before you get into the technical part of the coding. I think that most behavioral questions, this is definitely not true across the board, but most of them just generally start with the question, tell me about a time when ... and then you fill in the blank. So some examples of this are, tell me about a time where you worked with others, tell me about a time where you failed at something, tell me about a time where something didn't go as planned and how you changed direction to make it work. So all of these questions really, and even the other questions that they might ask that are behavioral based, kind of rely on you to tell a story about a time where you did the thing that they're asking you about. So my technique for this, and I think this is super effective, and if you don't have this, you should definitely come up with something similar, but I've sort of picked one or two computer science stories from my past that sort of answer all of these questions. So whenever they throw me a tell me about a time when, I have a story ready to go, and then I can sort of formulate it to fit the question that they were asking. So I'm going to tell you my story that I always tell the recruiter, which I think is a pretty good story, and then you can think back in your life where something that answers a lot of questions also happened to you, and then you can use a story about your own life in the same way that I use a story about my life. So when I was an intern back at a company a long time ago, I was working on a project with two other interns, and we were not super supervised. Like, it was a pretty independent project. And as such, we were kind of given the freedom to make our own decisions about the project. So we had no experience really with web development, and that was the thing we were being tasked with. So they wanted us to code in a certain type of framework. So if you're familiar with web development, this is kind of like React, something like that. If you're not, it doesn't really matter for the purposes of this story. But they basically wanted us to code not just in plain code, but sort of in a wrapper that other people could use. So we asked around a little bit, but nobody seemed to have a preference about what framework we chose. So we just did our own Google research and we chose a framework called Vue.js, which is supposed to be very easy for beginners to learn, and that's basically why we chose it, because we thought it would be the easiest for us to learn. So we coded our whole project in Vue for 2 weeks, and then after 2 weeks, our manager told us that, actually, could you switch it to React? Which is like the most common one that people use. And he didn't tell us this from the get-go, so this was kind of frustrating, and we had to redo all of this code. So that really sucked. But what we did was we just coded the whole thing again in React, and it actually only took us a week because Vue and React are not so far apart. So the lessons from that story basically are, one, you gotta really get the answers to your questions up front, even if people are giving you a non-answer. Try to dig a little deeper and don't just consult the internet. I think that's a big one. Two, even if you lose time doing something one way, the approach was probably informative and will teach you something. So this is evidenced by the fact that we were able to rebuild it in React in half the time that it took us to build in Vue, because we learned a lot when we built it in Vue the first time. This is also a good example of a time that I failed at something. I failed to choose the right framework at the beginning, and it cost us a lot of time at the end. And it's a good example of something that I would have done differently in the past. It's also an example of a time where I worked with others. I definitely could have worked better with others, so it was a learning experience, but you kind of get the idea. It's a time where something went wrong, you learned from it. It's nice that it's coding related, but I think this can be anything in your life. But if you have a specific coding related story, I would highly suggest that you pick that one for the purposes of this interview, because they might ask you for like a coding specific story for your interview. The next part of this video, I feel like, is why most people clicked on this video, and it's about the technical component of the software engineering interview. This is by far the hardest part, I feel like, for almost everybody, unless you're a genius coder. So most people will tell you that you should get a copy of Cracking the Coding Interview, the Computer Science Bible, And this is true. You should probably like get one from the library or borrow one from a friend, but my personal advice is that cracking the coding interview is only going to get you so far, and it's probably not the way that you're going to master software engineering interviews. The real thing that you should do to ace your software engineering interviews is hop onto LeetCode. LeetCode, if you haven't heard of it, is a website where you can do practice problems for software engineering interviews. And the number one thing I want to say about software engineering interviews and coding interviews in particular is that you're only going to get good at them if you practice. And I feel like with cracking the coding interview, you can do a little practice, but actually being able to do it in the text editor through LeetCode, and now that everything is sort of virtual, you're probably definitely going to be doing it over Zoom in an actual text editor. That practice is invaluable, and it's so much better than the practice you're going to get from the actual cracking the coding interview book. Wow, they've changed this since I was here. Okay, yes. You're gonna want to go to the problems category, and I'll leave these links down below. And what you're gonna wanna do is you are going to want to make a LeetCode plan for yourself. You should, at minimum, in like the time that you're ramping up for interviews, so say you have a lot of interviews in the month of January, you wanna spend at least 2, probably 4 weeks in December doing at least one LeetCode problem every day. So if you don't feel ready to jump into coding problems right away, which like if I were trying to do this, I definitely would not, then I would grab a copy of Cracking the Coding Interview and just skim the sections on data structures and algorithms for about 2 days, just to make sure you kind of absorb everything, you kind of remember the key points, and then I would jump into LeetCode, because LeetCode is really the place where you're gonna get everything together. So what I would do is I would start out with the easy problems. So I would do easy problems. I think the hard problems on LeetCode are very, very hard. This is just from my experience. I don't think your actual technical coding challenges are going to necessarily be that hard. Obviously, it depends on the company and the interview and blah, 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 but I think you can definitely land a job just by practicing easy and medium problems. So if I were you, I would just do the random pick one button where it picks a random problem, and each day I would try to do one easy problem and one medium problem. That would be my game plan for all the days leading up to my technical interviews. So I would just do the random pick one here. If it's a hard problem, personally, I'd skip it, but if you're really feeling like you know what's going on, you can do the hard problem. But basically, if you haven't seen this interviews before, it just gives you a problem on one side and a place to code the answer on the other side. And this can be very challenging. You might only get like some of the answers, so they basically run a bunch of test cases on your solution, and then you can see what's right and what's wrong. I would just switch it to the language you want. I would pick another problem if this one was a hard problem, so I'm picking, okay, so this is an easier problem. And then I would just go through the problem and try to do it as best you can. My tip for this also is to make sure that you're thinking of the test cases that they're gonna test in your head, because generally when you're doing an actual software engineering interview, you're going to be asked to write the test cases yourself. So this will be better both in making sure you get the problem right the first time and also learning how to do this for your actual technical interviews. So through doing LeetCode a lot, you're going to figure out what areas you need to specifically focus in. This might be, oh my gosh, I'm very bad at problems that have to do with 2D arrays and I never know what I'm doing when I'm doing that. Or, oh my gosh, when they ask me to code a certain type of data structure, I just don't know what I'm doing. So you're going to want to focus in those problem areas, and then after a certain amount of time, you're going to want to go through the LeetCode problems page and pick problems that are specific to the areas that you're facing difficulty in. I've said it before, I'm going to say it again, the only way that you're going to get better is by just practicing more problems. So once you figure out your weaknesses, my next tip or suggestion would be to pair up with a friend who's also preparing for coding interviews, if you know one, and just come up with a bunch of problems and give them to each other and basically do mock interviews. So when you're giving the problem, you learn the problem really well and it's a good exercise for you, and obviously when you're receiving the problem, it's good practice for you. So I think this is definitely a win-win, and the real life aspect, I feel like, is kind of a motivational tool that you're going to want to prepare for. You're not going to want to fail miserably in front of your friend. I mean, it's totally fine if you do, but I feel like the friend card there makes you want to prepare a little bit more. If you don't know anybody who's doing mock interviews, if you're a member of any like computer science organizations, I know there are a couple for women specifically, or if you go to a college or a university or a boot camp even, there are going to be other organizations within that. You can probably find people within those organizations who will want to pair with you. And then And as a final resort, there are also resources online where you can be randomly matched with someone from online who can prepare to do an interview with you. And if you really want, you can just have one of your parents or a random friend who doesn't know CS just go on LeetCode and give you a random problem, and they don't need to know anything about coding. They can just give it to you and watch you do it and make sure you do it. Generally, from my experience, the most common questions that people like to ask about are anything having to do with 2D arrays. They love the overlapping set questions, so I would definitely know how to do an overlapping set question. They like it when their question basically is implementing a hash map or a queue or a linked list, so I would definitely brush up on those types of questions as well. They're not so big into dynamic programming. I would say across the board, people are going to give you questions that you could be able to answer after taking a year of computer science. So after taking data structures and algorithms, you should probably be able to answer 95% of the questions that you're going to be given in software engineering interviews. It's just about practice at that point. So speaking of practice, if you have the opportunity to do a lot of interviews at a lot of different places, even if they're not places you want to work, I highly recommend just doing the interviews. One, it's really good practice, even if you don't want to work there. And two, I feel like people generally interview 30 to 40 times before they actually end up with a job offer. So you're going to want to put in the work to eventually get an offer. And I think doing actual interviews at actual companies might actually lead to something you might like. So you might not be super interested in a company, but maybe after interviewing with them, you end up really liking the people and stuff like that, and you do really well in those interviews. Then that's one more option for you if you're able to get the job at that company. And if you're not, no worries. It was just a good practice round for building up your skills to do the actual technical interviews. In addition, if you are doing an interview at a company and you finish, no matter if you feel like you aced it or you didn't ace it, I would definitely write down the question. I think the best questions come from actual interviews. So also if you know anybody else who's doing software engineering interviews, you can tell them, hey, you want to write down the questions, and then we can exchange questions, just so that you're getting a wider range of questions than the stuff that's just on LeetCode. I feel like LeetCode is pretty good, but it's always nice to know what companies might be asking. Similarly, in that same vein, if you're interviewing at a specific company, you can go on their Glassdoor under software engineering. So let's say I want to work at Robinhood. Okay, I just searched Robinhood on Glassdoor. We can go under interviews here, this tab, and we can look at the software engineer interviews, for example. And a lot of people will write these kinds of things. So tell me about yourself. What is a large challenge? You could use your software engineering story to answer that question. But a lot of people will write down like a small version of the technical question that they got, or just a general overview. So, okay, algorithm using a priority queue. So maybe you want to brush up on your priority queues if you're interviewing for Robinhood. Something like that. Resolving a string, sliding median. So these are the kinds of things you can find on Glassdoor, so it might be a good way to sort of guide your search if there's a specific company you're very interested in working at. And finally, for the afterwards. So after the interview or the technical part of the interview is over, definitely have some good questions to ask, especially if you have extra time. They're always going to ask you, hey, do you have any questions? And you should always take this time to ask good questions, not just do you like your job kind of questions, but really thought out questions, especially questions specific to the company. Definitely have a reason that you want to work at that company, anything from the mission to the tech stack that they're working on, something specific to that company so they know you're interested. Some examples of good questions to ask your interviewer are, what are some qualities that the most successful software engineers at your company have? Something like that, where it's like a more thought out question that they don't have an immediate answer to. And then they might say something like, oh, good question. And that might be the way that they remember you. So definitely leave a good last impression, even if you completely bomb the interview. This is gonna happen. This happens to everybody. You totally bomb an interview and you're like, damn, I really bombed it. Regardless, if you bombed it, you think you aced it, after the interview is over, send the person you interviewed with and or your recruiter a message being like, thank you so much for the time, taking the time to meet me. I really appreciate considering me for this role. Please keep me abreast of any updates about anything I can do or help you with to move my application forward. Something simple, straight to the point, positive. Even if you bombed, it will leave a better taste in their mouth, and who knows, you might want to work there again in the future, so it's definitely good to be on a recruiter's good side. So I'm gonna make a different video about how to even get an interview and how to master this whole process, but this was just specifically about the interview itself, how to do really well on the software engineering interviews. And I definitely didn't cover everything, and I don't have all the knowledge. So if there's something specific that you think I missed, definitely leave a comment down below and I'll respond to you and we can all learn from one another. But I think the main takeaway from this is that more interviews equals more practice, and more practice equals higher probability of success. If you do a thing more times, you're bound to be good at it at least one time. And in the grand scheme of things, you only need to be successful one time if you're trying to get a job. So you might want like a certain dream role, but you might end up somewhere else, and you can always move to a different company at a different time, or you can move to a different job at a different time. But I think that just generally practicing, spending a lot of time on LeetCode, just putting in the work to remind yourself how you do these kinds of problems, I think is the only way that you're gonna pass a technical interview with any company that you might work for. Don't just wing it because you feel like, I took data structures and algorithms this past semester, I know what's happening. You definitely need to practice, and with practice, you'll definitely be successful. So I wish you all the best of luck. Leave me a comment. Don't forget to like this video, subscribe to my channel, and let me know what else you want to see. And I'll see you in my next video. Bye.